So a very good evening to everyone who's actively and eagerly tuned into City Speaks webinar today. My name is Anna, intern at City Speaks, and I'll be taking you to today's events. This webinar is part of a land governance series that City Speaks has undertaken and is the first of many webinars. Before proceeding further, I would like to thank everybody here on behalf of City Speaks for such an amazing turnout. I also see a few guests from our previous webinar, Professor Mahalay Chatterjee being one of them. We're eternally grateful for your support. At this point, I'll take a few minutes to introduce City Speaks to those who are new to the organization. City Speaks is a young startup founded in 2019 by Ms. Srilekha Adi. It works in the field of urban research and civic engagement. City Speaks is driven by the desire of bridging the asymmetry in information pertaining to small cities in India. City Speaks rests a firm conviction in planning that is participatory, governance that is resilient, and urban spaces that are inclusive. With its primary focus on small cities in India, through its research, City Speaks aims to bring about contextually embedded policies that elicit participative planning, resilient governance, and inclusive and sustainable cities. To begin with, I would request all of you to keep your microphones muted throughout the event. The topic of today's discussion, as you already know, is land pooling the answer to contested land acquisition? Scarcity of land in India has caused economic and infrastructural problems since time immemorial. With the enactment of the Land Acquisition and Rehabilitation Act of 2013, it became even harder for the government to procure land. Land pooling has come as a savior in this matter. As an organization based out of Andhra Pradesh, we're all too familiar with the land pooling scheme, with the Amravati debacle, and now the Visakhapatnam housing scheme. And as a budding alternative to land acquisition, it is important to discuss land pooling extensively. To give us a perspective into this matter, we welcome Mr. Triveni Prasad Nanda. We would like to thank you, sir, for readily accepting our invitation. Mr. Nanda is the assistant professor at the School of Construction of the RICS School of Built Environment at Amity University, Noida. I would also like to thank Ms. Aparna Soni. A big thank you to you, ma'am, for taking time out of your schedule to be with us here today. Ms. Soni is the assistant professor at the School of Real Estate and Urban Infrastructure of the RICS School of Built Environment at Amity University, Noida. As is customary, we would love to delve into their many achievements and endeavors. However, speaking of them briefly would be an understatement of their expertise. Hence, we leave that for you to read in the chat section. Before handing the platform over to you, I would like to remind the audience to keep their microphones muted. At the end of the talk, there will be a small question-answer session. You're requested to leave your questions in the chat section for them to answer. Over to you guys.
Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you for the introduction. So I'll take you through the presentation, what we have planned for today. As you have rightly introduced, and see, we don't need to discuss the importance of land for development of any state, right? So we'll just delve directly into today's topic, which is land pooling, right? And is it the answer, or the rightful heir to land acquisition, right? So what we'll do is we will look at several aspects of land supply mechanisms, and then we will look at land acquisition specifically and what land pooling is trying to achieve by either circumventing or bypassing the acquisition route wholly or partially, right? So let's see what we are going to cover in this very brief time that we have got. So the first thing that so these are the topics that we are going to cover in this uh, presentation today. So we first look at the urban land supply, its history and evolution, right? And then we look at the land supply of new urban forms which are in India. Then to then to solidify our research, there are two cases that we have identified. One is the high-tech townships policy of Uttar Pradesh and the Delhi land pooling policy of first 2013. Then it was an abject failure, and then it was revised in 2018. So we'll look at both the cases, and then we'll have a brief look at other tools and models of land assembly, very close to cooling, and then we'll discuss the key takeaways of this session and what kind of research we can do further, right? So this is how we will start. Some
Triveni, I cannot see the screen moving. I'm on the first slide yet.
Oh,
is the slide visible now to be covered?
No.
No. Can can the can the participants please tell me whether the screen is being shared? Can you all see this? Yeah. So I'm getting the confirmation from Shilekha that they are seeing this. Ma'am, is it visible to you now?
Not yet.
Okay, let's try in a minute. So you can open the slides that we have instead. Might be an issue. Right. So
Yeah, you carry on. I'll try and see this.
yeah, sure. Sure. Yeah. So first of all, we need to talk about the land supply principles. Yeah. So as some of you might have heard about the economic principles behind land supply, of course, we are not going to go into the details of the socio-political economy of land, but the precursor to every land, supply was the principle of previous accumulation uh, promulgated by Adam Smith. Then we had the principle of primitive accumulation, uh, you know, uh, developed by Karl Marx. And then we had in the 650s until the 70s, we had David Harvey, who talked about accumulation by disposition, and a scholar by the name of Michael Levine, who has done extensive research on the land supply issues in India. Uh, they are right now proposing a model which is also called disposition without development. So it's a very new concept, which is quite relevant to what is happening in this country, and I would love for you guys to read up on it further. And it is very relevant what is happening in India right. So these are the four stages of urban land supply and the background to it. Next, we'll look at the evolution of land supply development in India, right? So, as we all know, the Land Acquisition Act of 1894, which was repealed in 2013, and the new act was, promulgated. Now, it was preceded by the Land Acquisition Act of 1894 from the pre-independence era, and we all know the draconian nature of it, and we do not need to discuss further why it was an issue and why we needed to repeal it way before. And the machinations of the politics and the democracy, that is how it's run. It took us about more than 60 years to repeal that draconian act and come forward with an act which is you know pro people, right? You just have to see the nature of the timeline of land acquisition and why and how the land was acquired in the Nehruvian socialism era post independence. We all know that our first prime minister had the principles of socialism behind him, and he acquired land for the greater principle of nation building, right? And then we had the watershed moment of the liberalization period of 1991, and then we had the capital. Now the majority player in development of land was state. It has always been the state since our independence. After independence, the game changed entirely when the the major player for land development was not anymore the state, but the private industry, right? So that is how it changed from the state to the private sector. And from 1991, we had to come up with principles which will be alternate to acquisition, because acquisition route was very difficult for the private sector to do even then, right? But somehow we had loopholes which were exploited to facilitate the private parties to build, to take land and build in this country, which is actually required for many projects. But of course we know it has been established as a fact by a lot of research, and there is an established body of research which says that the 1894 act was exploited uh, to uh, to the extent that it had to be repealed. No modification could absolve the act from the sins that it had committed, and the 60 years that this country had spent in having that kind of an existing act, and still trying to exploit the citizens, and exacerbating the issue of land ownership, which is anyway one of the lowest anywhere in the world, right? So now we further move on to the land supply in the new urban forms. Now, as you can see here, if I'll just try to annotate, see, as you can see here, the public facilitated led private purchase, the top is the state acquisition, in the middle somewhere lies land pooling. So what happens is, most of the land development which is happening right now in the country is the private purchase model or the private purchase route, whereas the public agencies or the state here just facilitates it, right? Facilitates it. The topmost tier is the state acquisition, which is happening even rarely, and slowly it is going out of fashion, it is going out of vogue. Why it is going out of vogue, we'll discuss in our further slides. So here you can see, for both, now there are several models which were happening, like the Navi Mumbai model and the Amravati model, which were state land pooling schemes, which were state led land pooling schemes, right? And then we had project specific concessionaire models, where private equity was spent to take land and to develop projects, like best examples being the Magarpatta and the Lavasa city, right? And then we had a lot of innovative policies from the, like the Delhi land pooling policy of 2013 and 2018. You will find this being discussed in our further slides by Ms. Aparna Soni later on. So let's go to the next slide. Just a second. So right now we have several models of land assembly all over the world. Some of the major ones which actually spurted the growth or inspired many other land assembly models are these. First one being the voluntary agreement amongst the owners for achieving land assembly. This is the UK private sector model. Then there was the public authority controlled and the compulsorily effected land readjustment model of Germany. Then in Singapore, you have a very unique model where the authoritarian state accumulates land to provide housing and to provide land for many other activities inside the boundaries or the limits of the state, right? And then you have the French model, which was voluntary, but it has recourse to the authorized framework. Then at the last, you have the Japanese model, which has an authorized framework designed on the majority rules, right? So you will actually find the details of all of these in our body of work, which we will give you the links to at the end of the talk. All right, so you can find about all of these models in detail when you read those. So the land pooling that is happening in India falls anywhere between them. So as you know, right now in India, after after the 1991 liberalization which happened, there was an infusion of a lot of capital. Now, wherever there is capital, there is scope for growth. But for growth, you need more projects. Now, for most projects, you need land, right? So it goes without saying that you always need land for projects to happen. So what kind of urbanism were we heading towards? So here you can see that we have a lot of we have now emphasized that the cities are engines of growth. So according to the latest census data of 2011, we are moving towards urbanization, which was unavoidable in the first place, and we are moving at a very fast rate of urbanization. So our cities are now our literal engines of growth. Now we have so much FDI which is flowing in from different countries. We have our IT policy and the SEZ acts. Now this all leads to one single thing: the India's urban awakening, right? So here we are looking at entrepreneurial cities. The smart cities program is an example of this. Now why we are calling this an we are calling it entrepreneurial cities? Because now you see cities competing amongst themselves to attract investment, right? So whoever right now the cities are not merely the governing agencies for the citizens within the city limits, but right now they are also startups who are trying to pitch their city to venture capitalists, who are inviting money to you, who are inviting people to come there and invest in their cities, right? Which will have eventually trickle down effects into many other jobs, which will result in jobs, which will result in the rise of the economy, etc., etc., right? So we have a lot of projects which are coming along to support those ideas, right? So the highways and expressways, the DFCs, right? We have SEZs, IT parks, industrial parks, and aerocities and aerotropolis. At least till the lockdown happened and the airports were closed, the hottest topic in the real estate circles was the concept of aerocities, right? So it was one of the brightest avenue of investment in the real estate sector, where there were a lot of projects in the pipeline, at least in India as well, uh, right? Where land will be developed along the airports, right? And there are other models of these like integrated townships and health cities and eco cities and medi cities, etc., etc., etc. Now all of this was put on, it was given a sudden jerk when the Land Acquisition Act of 2013 was promulgated. Now, the intent of the Land Acquisition Act was, of course, noble. It was required. It had to be done, right? But but we can actually see that the Land Acquisition 2013 made it very difficult for private entities to acquire land, right? So the sections which detailed the cause or the requirement of why a project needed acquisition, they were made very stringent, right? The rehabilitation and the resettlement policies were so stringent that it was becoming a headache for the private entities to acquire land for industries. And this is I mean, of course there has been a lot of research which has gone into this, and many of the industries have not seen the full life cycle of their industries yet, but it is somewhat in the ballpark, where after the 2013 act has come up, it usually takes about 48 to 50 months for an industry to set up their plants or mines in a by going through the acquisition route, right? So earlier, when it used to take anywhere between 20 to 30 months, is now pushed to about 48 to 50 months if you go by the prescribed timelines in the Land Acquisition Act. Now this made it too difficult for, first of all, the industries to establish. Then it was being difficult for states to raise money, right? So it was getting difficult for everybody in the ecosystem to earn money. to earn capital. So some kind of a solution was needed, right? So after 2013, you would notice that there was a flurry of so many tools and policies, so many innovations and experiments that were being done statewide everywhere, right? And this is not the exhaustive list. The slide that you're seeing right now is not the exhaustive list of all the innovative policies and models which have come post 2013, right? These are only some of them, and we are going to cover just two of these in today's slides, right? And this slide, mind you, is going to make an appearance again further in our presentation, because we'll discuss some of it again there. So I think I'll just hand over the mic, the proverbial mic right now, to my colleague, Ms. Aparna Soni, where she'll look at the experiments in UP and Delhi. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Triveni. Thank you, City Speaks. This is great an introduction to the presentation today. So I hope I'm audible and I'm visible to everybody. If there is someone who is unable to see me, please report that in the chat box. So I'll be telling you all a story about two states. One is UP and the other is Delhi. Essentially, our research work focuses on the northern parts of India. So we're going to tell you two stories about the two states. So essentially, Uttar Pradesh as a state started its experiments back in 2003, 10 years before the Act of 2013 could actually figure out. And they started their experimentation with a very interesting township policy, which was called the high-tech township policy. The high-tech township policy did this, that they allowed the private sector entities, for example, a developer, to assemble land through private purchase in a rural area, which is essentially outside the master planning area or the planning boundary, assemble it through private purchase, and then take the required license and develop a township on it as per the township development control regulations. Now, the way how they did it or they planned it was that the developer first will express his intention of developing a township in a particular part of the outskirts of a particular city. And once he expresses his intention, the state, the concerned authority, which can be a housing board or it can be a development authority, will judge the financial capacity, the experience level of that developer. Once they've done that and they find him worth being able to develop at least a minimum of 750 crore investment township, they will license the developer. Then they will go, and here is the state. The state will go and will notify the area which has been identified as the area for the township development. And they are going to then notify it as land under acquisition under the Land Acquisition Act. But then they're going to allow the private developer who has been licensed to go negotiate with individual landowners on a particular pricing at which they can sell the land. So what happens is that the farmer gets one way out. He has only two choices. One, he says, okay, I'll go for acquisition. Or two, he says, okay, I go for private purchase. So, and if you say, okay, can he say a no? Yeah, he can say a no, but then he cannot say no to acquisition. So what happens is that one of the examples is Lucknow as a city in the outskirts of which high-tech townships have come. There was Kanpur on the map. There was Meerut on the map. You can name the tire of the city, and you can find a high-tech township being proposed that in the landscapes. I hope I have answered you, Siddharth. So what happens is that once this acquisition notification is out, then the developer goes around buying land from different people, and he aggregates and assembles some amount of land. In the earlier format of this policy, it was not specified as to how much land should be in the ownership of the development entity or the consortium before proceeding to licensing and sanctioning the layout plan of the township. So what happened was that layout plans were sanctioned and construction would on paper begin, and allotment of a lot of the real estate that was getting generated on these lands would begin. But most of the projects saw no completion. They were not even in the stage of saying that they have the 100% land on their name. So a lot of townships got stalled for this reason, and therefore there were several amendments into this policy that kept coming from 2003 to 2006, then 2012, then there was another little amendment in 2008. So, this policy has kept evolving itself, and it ultimately boiled down to getting repealed. Now, when it started, it had no capping, but it said that the developer is required to have to develop the township with a minimum area of 1,500 acres. So he began with 1,500 acres. Then there were some amendments which allowed expansion, and the township could be expanded to as far as 7,500 acres. Now, this essentially is a very large scale of development. And what you look at is that they notify it as acquisition, they bring in private negotiation in between, and they also then, if, for example, if the developer is able to get 60% of the land that he had identified for the township, then the rest of the 25% remaining land can be facilitated by the government through acquisition, for which, of course, the acquisition cost will be borne by the private sector. And there was also another option which was called as the private negotiation model according to the Karar Niyamavali, which says that in the presence of the collector of that particular district, the private entity or the developer can negotiate with the owner of the land. So there was no way out being left for land acquisition to actually picture in, only but to fill the gaps. Even when I have the Triveni, when I have the permission, I'm still not being able to do this. Yeah. So what happened was that in 2013, and from 2003 to 2013, this policy kept seeing amendments, and finally in 2014, we got its sister integrated township policy actually taking the lead. So this second bracket that you see on the slide here, the integrated township bracket, this was also introduced in 2005. This was a smaller township, like starting from somewhere around 25 acres to around 500 acres to a maximum of 1,000 acres of land that you could develop, which was introduced in 2005. But in 2013, when the High-Tech Township Act got repealed, the integrated township policy took over, and all the townships that were sanctioned as high-tech townships were converted into a status of integrated townships. This was not the end of the story. In 2014, again, the State Urban Housing and Habitat Policy allowed for a land pooling scheme where a private developer could, in partnership with the landowners, pool 10 acres of land for a township. And then, of course, we've got the negotiated private purchase section in the Revised Land Acquisition Act of Uttar Pradesh after 2013, which further allows for private negotiation of land less than 10 acres by the government itself. So essentially, if there is any part of land which cannot be bought privately by the private entity, the state will buy it for him and transfer it to their name or lease it out to them for 90 years. Next, please. So what happens is that when we try and see all of this in a nutshell, what we find is that the peripheries of the city, which is beyond the master planning area, are very quickly transforming into urbanization beds. They are increasingly finding newer townships coming. Land is getting speculated. the land markets have literally distorted in the outskirts of the cities, and you can see how some of these big townships are there mushrooming in the outskirts of Lucknow on this map. Next, please. When we closely look at what sort of urbanization they induce into the peripheries of the city, we find that they are almost, tier 1 cities being annexed to the existing cities outside the planning boundaries without changes in master plans. So what is happening is that the master plans are being made to adhere to the presence, or are being made to surrender to the presence of these townships when they are getting revised for the coming 20-30 years. In Lucknow, we found that these townships, if they would have bloomed to their spirits and would have achieved the densities, the population densities that they were designed for, they would have almost added 9% to the city size and 22% to the population size of the city outside the municipal boundaries, which also leads us to a lot of questions around governance, a lot of questions around how would you provide for services and all other aspects around the shape and form of urbanization that we see. So we noticed that yes, the townships the policy did ease up making of townships, providing for housing and stuff of that sort, but it also had some after effects and some effects that are visible even today, where we're seeing land getting speculated, a lot of land getting commodified, we're seeing land markets being distorted, and governance being fragmented, and a lot of exclusions in terms of who can buy and who cannot buy happening in these private enclaves. Next, Triveni. Now, when we come to the land pooling policy of Delhi, you will find that this is a little different from the one that we just talked about in UP. This is more of a facilitation by the Delhi government to unlock the lands that they had locked. Now, when we say this, we say that this was for the first time when private sector was being allowed to assemble land in Delhi and develop and sell. Otherwise, private sector was more involved in construction activities and less in land development activities. So this Delhi land pooling policy, the main in charge still remains the Delhi Development Authority here. But what they allow is, for example, if you lie in one of the zones that we just had the map earlier on, if your land is in any one of the zones that are marked here on this particular map, next please, then you as a landowner can express your interest on the portal that they have, the Delhi Land Pooling Portal, which the DDA has formulated under the NIUA, National Institute of Urban Affairs. And they will collectively see if there is a portion of land in one of their planning areas or planning zones where a land pooling policy can be initiated. Simultaneously, there's going to be private sector developers who can express their interest also to be a part of a land pooling policy. Alongside this, the landowners can also find themselves a developer who would like to partner with them, and they would make one entity. So it will be a consortium of landowners with the private developer, and then they would express their interest in the land pooling policy. Once they do that, then there is a sharing mechanism between the people. So in the earlier model, you did not see that there is a sharing mechanism, but it was a direct transfer of land which was being allowed by the policy. But here in the land pooling policy, there is a share, which means the government gets to keep a portion of land and the people get, or the development consortium gets a portion of land, which with development rights to each defined by the master plan that was done. Now again, the journey for the Delhi land pooling policy wasn't easy. They started mooting about the idea in 2003, and they finally got a shape in 2013, and they even sent out the regulations for the Delhi land pooling policy 2013, for which they sent the document for approval in 2015. But the Delhi government denotified them the 2013 format, saying that Delhi doesn't have enough water. Now the whole question is, from 2003 to 2015, did DDA not know that Delhi has little water? Because what happened was that when in 2003 to 2013 to 2015, when these rules and regulations were being opened up in the public for approvals and for public consultations and other things, there was a lot of news, a lot of buzz in the air about what this scheme is about. And the private sector, along with the landowners, they actually started speculating. And a lot of partnerships and transfers and all of that started happening on ground without the land pooling policy actually formalizing and formally being thrown open to the people. So this led to a lot of confusion on ground, which intensified when in 2018 finally we got the land pooling policy in the format in which we see it today. And the point of contention was that the 2013 and the 2018 formats were poles apart. So all the people who had speculated and had made investments and had made partnerships and whatnot, speculating that they're going to be earning or benefiting from this particular scheme coming up, actually were awe-stricken. They were like, okay, we don't know what's happened to the scheme. And this led to almost 40% rise in the number of the contestations that could have cropped up in the markets, and the lawyers were flooded with such court cases being fought in the local courts. Next slide, please. So let us see what this difference was between 2013 and 2018. We can skip this through act. So when we look at the differences, the first major difference was in the basic structure itself. Earlier, the model had two categories of land, and there were two different percentages of land being retained by DDA and by the development entity. Next, please. Which actually got reduced to only one understanding, that if you have a plot more than 2 hectares of land pooled together, you are eligible for land pooling, and you will get 60% of the land back, and 40% of the land will be retained by the Delhi Development Authority. But we have to remember that this 40%, which is to be taken by DDA at a later point in time when they need it, they will ask you for it. You here is the development entity. They will ask you for it, but you have to keep that land until you give it away or until you pass it on to Delhi Development Authority with no encumbrances, which means that the development entity has to ensure that there is no fraud, that there is no encroachment, and that there are no legal issues around that land for all the while until the Delhi Development Authority takes that land from you. But remember, you are not allowed to use that land. You are only supposed to keep it as a custodian with you until DDA asks you for it. Next. The other big change which happened was that earlier the land pooling schemes were being seen as zones. Now they're looking at them as sectors, and the size of a sector in Delhi is much smaller. So you need a very precise patch of land. Essentially, it is 70%, and a contiguous patch of land which abuts a 30-meter wide master plan road, which is in the future to be drawn, if you want to pool land. And it is only then when rest of the 30% can be acquired by the Delhi Development Authority to facilitate the sector planning for you. Next, Triveni. Then very important difference which actually really upset the private sector was the reduction in the FAR, where FAR was earlier proposed to be 400. It was reduced to the master plan FAR, which is still 200. So no one understands what is the benefit of giving back 40% of land to the Delhi Development Authority when you are essentially getting only 200 FSI, which you are which way getting if you are making it as per master plan. Alongside this, they have also included a lot of propositions of purchasable FAR and fungible FSI and all of those fundamentals to actually try and make this scheme lucrative. But the private sector isn't finding the merit in it. Also, the concept of development control regulations, which tells you the density, the population density in primary ways, has been replaced by form-based codes. So they are not going to be building bylaws, but they're going to be form-based codes, which are going to be differential density areas. So it all matters where on space are you actually able to pull land, which will make all the difference if you earn from it or if you don't earn from it. And that still remains in the hands of the DDA to design the master plan and the zonal plans, which has yet not been done by the Delhi Development Authority, and the maps are not made public. Next, please. So we bring ourselves back to this discussion. Now we saw in UP the volatility, the ad hocism in the policy, and how policy was itself changed and then repealed and then brought in back again, and things of that sort. And then in Delhi also we are seeing that the Delhi Development Authority isn't taking accountability of a lot of things, and a lot of speculation has happened and land markets already stand distorted. But we also notice in both these policies that none of them try and talk about the precursors and the prerequisites of these two policies. As in, for example, if you want the Delhi land pooling policy to be successful, that is, if the landowners can partner with a development entity, with a developer, their land records need to be straight, need to be clear. But this sector itself hasn't been worked upon in any of the states. We know the amount of mess that exists. Also, you're expecting a landowner to be literate enough to get into complex contractual arrangements with developing entities without having proper know-hows. So there's a lack of capacity. And you are exposing the landowners to such risks which they have not known. Real estate sector, real estate projects are full of risks, right? Now we also have to note that when Real Estate Regulatory Authority and the act which supports it was brought into action, it also along with it brings a lot of do's and don'ts, which are themselves a little tricky to understand. And they also pose in a lot of restrictions onto the development of the real estate. It changes the whole development cycle. But these nuances are not known by the primary stakeholder in the two models that we saw, which was the landowner, right? So we feel that it might be a good option to have these alternatives available on you, but there is a lot of homework that needs to be done behind these, and our states essentially are not ready with that homework. The alarming part of the story is the slide, where you see that there are so many types of formats and forms and sorts of policies that are actually getting enforced. And one has to notice that none of them are pertaining to direct correlation with the revenue department. They are largely sourcing their power through the urban development regulatory framework or industrial development regulatory framework, which is not lying under the jurisdiction of the revenue department. So the revenue department is essentially an outsider who simply facilitates the process of land assembly. There are also some interesting examples like the state negotiated and direct purchase models, which are source their powers from the Land Acquisition Act, but they commodify the whole rehabilitation and resettlement entitlements of landowners. There are no litigation premiums. Yes, you've heard it. There are no litigation premiums being given to landowners. Matlab ek tarike se they're bribing people that you take this much more money and keep your mouth shut. You please don't go to the court saying that you disagree to the compensation that has been given to you. So people are being given premiums in Punjab and Haryana to not litigate further on the acquisition that they have just seen. So next, Triveni. When we're seeing all of this brings us to a lot of things that we need to actually think about. Would you like to speak on this, Triveni?
Yeah, sure. So there is a very alarming anecdote that ma'am would recognize. We heard an official, of course we won't take the name, we heard an official from the Delhi Development Authority who was in charge of the land transaction and the planning in DDA, and he was once commenting that due to the lack of poor communication from the authority side or the government side, the major stakeholder who is the landowner does not have the right capacity or the know-how of the process of this pooling. Also, they do not first of all own or have the incorrigible knowledge of the boundaries of their own land property. There is no conclusive titling which is available in this country all over, right? Of course, there are efforts which are being carried in many states, but the information that we got from the person in DDA was, he said that he has right now fighting about 20,000 odd cases in the Delhi High Court, and those 20,000 odd cases relate to land titles, and many of those cases relate to these land pooling, the Delhi land pooling, where the people wanted to uh, take the benefit of the land pooling, and since they did not know who is the clear owner of the land within those zones, now they are fighting these things in court. Now we know what kind of a load our judiciary has right now in this country, and instead of going instead of settling constitutional and criminal cases, they are just trying to douse the fire of these simple civil issues. So it goes very deep. I mean, we need a very systemic change where where we need good central policies which can guide land assembly mechanisms. And as ma'am just mentioned in these two examples, if you see Punjab and Haryana, when people are being literally bribed to not file any case, basically what you are doing is you are being asked to waive off your own rights to ask about your property, and that is cruel to uh, to be very be very in a very simple manner, you can say it's very cruel, right? So some key takeaways that we saw in our session today is we can see that urban sprawl is a big issue, right? Now the urbanization, is it being state led or is it just being corporate targets? We are keeping these questions open ended because of course we need questions and we need further discussions. We do not want to give any final word on this, of course, right? So is the urban sprawl uh, being targeted by the corporates, and is the government being just boiled down to being a mere facilitator, right? Also another thing, we are seeing that the planning is being privatized, right? And the planning bodies are being morphed, the parastatals are now being morphed into planning bodies. A prime example of this is the Delhi Mumbai Industrial Corridor, DMICDC. They are now becoming the primary planning body for greenfield cities like uh, Dolera, right? And which is unheard of. It is not supposed to happen. The parastatals do not have that power to plan an urban settlement. They are not supposed to do that, right? Then you have seen the UP example is a prime example, and in fact the new Chandigarh is also a very good example of the increasing dependence of real estate development, right? When you make the urban development of your city dependent on the real estate development, then you are exposed to all the risks that a real estate project has. Now your city is primarily dependent on the success or the failure of your real estate projects, and that's scary, right? Now, you also saw there are so many speculative forms of governance, right? So we are seeing judicial activism from the lower courts, from the high courts, from the Supreme Court. We are looking at the citizen bodies, the CBOs and the RWAs, right, who are ruling the roost. There is the 74th Amendment was brought in because of a reason. It was brought in, right, to devolve or decentralize the power of the states into the urban local bodies. They are there for a reason, but you are seeing that the CBOs and the RWAs are actually ruling the roost, right? And in the case of Lucknow, we just saw that three or four of those high-tech townships are outside the municipal boundaries of the cities. That means the municipality does not have any jurisdiction over those projects. Now, the RWAs are the only organization per se who have any say over the maintenance or the upkeep of those societies. But that is not supposed to happen that way, right? So there is a lack of municipal uh, governance
Yes, yes.
here as well,
Yeah.
right? So there are a lot of issues when we try to bypass the systems of acquisition and we try to innovate where innovation is not required. Yes, we require innovation, of course, but if you can see, if you notice this sorry, if you notice, I'm really sorry, if you notice this slide, this, by the way, let me reiterate, this slide is not the exhaustive list of every policy or model which has been started post 2013. This is not the exhaustive. There are several others which we have not covered here, right? So the sheer amount of policies which do not have any what do you say that legislative backing, because remember, these are just models which are bureaucratic setups. They do not have any legislative backing, so they do not have the continuity that an established act has. It does not have the accountability that an act mandates, right? And that leads to a lot of issues, which I think ma'am would like to cover here. Over to
Yeah.
you.
So when I look at some more things to add, like I said, you will start noticing that most of these states have got these, new policy handles to supply land for development, both for urban development, urban expansion, and for industrial development. And you will also notice that one state can have is more than 4 or 5 land pooling or land readjustment schemes and policies. One will be for industrial purpose, the other for urban expansion, the third one can be project specific, the fourth one can be specially for a central body like an Rotropolis or something of that sort. So you may have more than one model, each one of them imparting different sorts of incentives and benefits to the private sector, and promising different things to landowners. So there's a lot of parity in what these policies are on ground giving to the landowners. And what we observe is that these models replace the Land Acquisition Act, and the Land Acquisition Act is only being used to fill the gap. The second important, you can say, observation is that these the policies are enforced through government orders and notifications and rules, which you will find extremely difficult to trace if you have to trace their evolution or if you have to trace their timeline. So which one is the latest? This controls information. So there is a sense of information being controlled and not getting into the public domain as easy as the acts are available. Importantly, of course, I talked about land speculation and distortion of land markets. I talked about landowner being the new private developer, which is a very important thing to be noted down. These are, like I said, parallel pieces of legislation. So it is just your mere fate as to your land lies in X area and you get to reap the benefits of a policy, or you don't get to reap the benefits of the other policy. More and more focus is going on negotiation-based assembly of land, even by the state. So the state, when the state has to take land, they are avoiding acquisition, and they are undermining the Land Acquisition Act. Now, when we say the two things together, what I want to say is that the state was under tremendous pressure with a lot of contestations and a lot of court cases going on land acquisition related issues, which they have very silently with these policies been able to transfer to the relationship which the landowner will share with the development entity tomorrow. So all the land-based contestations that were happening due to acquisition have been transferred onto the next stage of land development, which is a consortium or a contract or a give and take relationship that formulates between the landowner and the development entity, and it is not the state here. So these are some very important observations. Can I have the next one, Triveni? And you can see that most of these land pooling policies that you notice across states, they all have very few features to share, which are common. They are mostly fit for purpose, and we can research more to find out if that purpose was profit, or like we said, corporate targets, or was it the general good. I can give you an example. When the High Tech Township Act to 2013 was called off and said, no, this policy doesn't exist in the state anymore, the state housing and habitat policy clearly wrote that these townships and these policies have not been able to provide for affordable housing. So they are only essentially supplying for the middle income group, which itself is a policy failure if they were not being able to solve for the purpose. And therefore, fit for profit or fit for purpose is another question that you have to start asking yourself. And as Triveni also pointed out, the failure of the 74th CAA and the decoupling of the revenue department, and the reliance of these schemes on remaining self-financed, or the land component of the project coming from the landowner, which is like increasing their stake. So it's about letting the landowner imagine a fancy, rosy future picture, right? A crore, township minimum size to come up, and that to be built within a time period of 5 years, with all the permissions and sanctions and ups and downs and everything that a real estate project sees. Everything seems to be a distant dream. So a landowner who used to get at least something like a compensation has now transcended to be a partner in the development scenario. He has both the faces to see. He can actually become a millionaire by being partner into a successful project. Whereas the flip side of the coin is that the project fails and he literally gets nothing. So these are the two sides that we wanted to bring up. So the question remains, and in fact, if you ask myself and Triveni, most of our research work has said that yes, the land pooling models and the land readjustment models and all can be a replacement or can be an answer to the contested land acquisition acts, but there needs to be a lot of homework done behind standardizing these schemes and policies, behind including policy accountability into these policies, so that the stake of the landowners and the agency of the state are clearly visible and are clearly spelled out in the policies, so that when someone vouches for it, he's an aware person, he's an aware player in the real estate market vouching for it, and not a naive landowner who is having a parcel of land in the far-flung peripheries of a city in any of the urban areas of our country. You would like to add something to any of this?
Yeah, and we, we took a call of not discussing Amravati here. We did not even want to discuss the abject failure of Amravati. Now, City Speaks being based in Vishakhapatnam must be totally aware of it. And also, since the issue is right now, somewhat waddling in between abject policy failure and being in limbo. So we did not want to discuss the failure of Amravati model in our session today, because we have not found any one or a single project or a single model which has been a proven 100% successful model. We are yet to find any model of land assembly which bypasses the acquisition route, which has been proven 100% successful, which was made for a purpose and it was successful. There are none. There are none yet. Of course, we are yet to see, I don't know, the numerous models that we showed you in one of the slides, 30 odd. There may be even more. Some one or two might click. Now only time will tell when that happens. But as of now, any model which has tried to, circumvent or bypass the acquisition route has failed in our opinion and our research that which has shown.
Yes.
So I
So
think
I think we are done.
yeah, this is just the future scope of research and the line of which we have established, and these are some of the topics in which we are doing research right now, which are an extension of the work that we showed you. So we are looking at speculative forms of governance, the role of judiciary, citizen activism, and governance, response which are inescapable. We are trying to map urban sprawl. We want to look at several things which are related to urban sprawl. You can get the details from the slide. We are also looking at the planning framework or the apparatus, and if it requires any revision. We also implore the listeners, the audience here, or if you yourself do that, or if you are associated with any of the faculty of law who needs to do research on the legal aspects of the regulatory frameworks, right? And so these are some of the areas in which we are researching on right now. So we are open to collaborations as well. So we would be happy to invite any of the listeners here who want to do further research on this. We would be more than happy to work with you. I think that's our cue, ma'am. Thank you so much. That's
Thank you,
where we
everybody.
Thank you so much to the two of you. I think it was truly a fresh take that you provided us with. We covered the LARR 2013 and how it made it difficult for private entities to acquire land and how it became difficult for states to raise money. We also took a look at how the 74th CAA failed. We took a look at different tools and policies that were innovated post 2013 with a special look into the UP and Delhi experiments, like the high-tech township policy that built townships outside the municipal bounds of the city, which was eventually repealed, and the integrated township policy. We also took a look at the Delhi land pooling policy that was initiated to unlock the lock lands to allow private sectors to participate in the development of land rather than just construction, and the uneasy differences between the 2013 structure and the 2018 structure. It is abundantly clear that we need good central policies to solve the land issues of the people. Some standardization or policy accountability is the need of the hour. I would now like to open the floor for questions from the audience. Kindly direct your questions to the chat section. We've also received a few questions prior to this webinar. I'll be going over those too. The first one is the existing land acquisition laws are overlapping and often stand as a constraint while processing an acquisition. How can we address this issue? If we consolidate such a framework, what must be its essentials?
You'd like to take it, Triveni?
I would suggest that the state land acquisition acts need to be more in line with the central land acquisition act. The problem comes in where there are differing opinions between the states and the center. And when the state straight away says that the acquisition model is not feasible anymore, we are going to experiment with several land supply initiatives, then the whole purpose of having an act fails, right? So the need of the hour is, see, the LARR 2013 is an objectively good act. It has made it difficult for projects to commence operation, but it is fair. It is fair. So those kind of project timelines need to be taken in while the feasibility models are being created for the projects. So it is not out of the realm of possibility that a project can't exist within the frameworks of the LARR. So the state acts, in fact, have to align themselves to the central act, and uh, I think it is the need of the hour, and that needs to be done. That's my view, ma'am. Do you want to add something to this?
Yeah, my take would be that there's no harm in having more than one legislation in a state,
Yeah.
because any which But when we are having more than one legislation, one has to see that there should be no parity to the same sort of a stakeholder. For example, a landowner here who essentially needs, treatment with equity. Alongside that, when there are parallel legislations, we also have to see if these parallel legislations have the required, you can say, basic framework in place to be successful pieces of legislation. So you ask any law student and they're going to tell you that, yes, every law requires some sort of a background where you need that law to be efficient only when you get that conducive environment. So there is merit in trying to give a standard pattern or a language to these acts and not be as free flowing as and flexible that they are. We may call flexibility a positive word, but we may like to also replace the word flexible with volatile, because they sometimes exist and then the next year they may not. So there's not a very tedious process around the coming and the going of these laws. So that's my take to it.
I have mentioned a name in the chat box. Everyone can cover that. So Dr. Namita Wahi from the Center of Policy Research, CPR, she does a lot of work on the overlap of these land acts. So I think they have a long running project which is going to culminate soon, which is about I think the topic is the land of 100 laws or a land of 1,000 laws. If I'm not wrong, I would suggest to go on and read her work. Dr. Namita Wahi, I have mentioned the name in the comment boxes. Please do read.
Thank you so much. Thank you. The next question is from Siddharth Agarwal. He asked, does the problem inherently lie in the fact that land being a state subject, the essence of a central law gets lost in politics?
Yeah, that's always there. While it was getting made, that was the whole point of contention there. And when you notice how different states have actually maligned the Central Act by making their state level rules, and they've almost taken the juice away out of the central legislation. So it's a good research work that you can do, although there's a lot that has been done to observe how different states have actually changed the Central Act, and they've formulated their own state rules to adjust to their local requirements and of course to the corporate targets that they have. So that's there. Plus also when you see 2015 ordinances that were passed while the Land Acquisition Act 2013 was enforced, you would notice that there was a lot of effort to actually not let this act be enforced in the format in which you see it today. So yes, of course that politics is there, no denying.
Do you believe regional planning, which isn't practiced like urban planning, would curb the land speculation and somehow ease the pressure on the LARR Act?
Okay, so district planning committees and the regional planning efforts. First of all, regional planning in India hardly happens. It happens in only the metropolitan regional planning authorities that you see. So all the MRs, metropolitan region, KMR, KMDA, KMR, MMR, NCR, and all of those regions. But if you look at the planning legislation and 74th CA, you do see something like the District Planning Committee. So yes, I personally believe that if there is something like a land use policy for every District Planning Committee, this can actually be controlled. And empowering the District Planning Committee with respect to land and land use by a policy, by an urbanization policy or a land use policy, which any which way doesn't exist for our country also, that can actually help. But the whole the reason why this doesn't happen is because district planning committees do not lie under the functions of the revenue department, and land basically is is belonging to the revenue department. It is only transferred to an urban development department when they want to develop it. So there is a governance issue there with respect to a resource which is very scarce. So maybe that's where the answer lies. We need to think about how the two departments might want to talk to each other. And of course, it is about empowering the TPCs and the MPCs that the 74th CA talks about.
Basically, it's a question of spreading the risks.
Yeah.
Essentially, it's just a question of spreading the risks. Once you start looking at the macro picture of it, when you spread the risks around in not just one urban area, but to an agglomeration of many urban centers, or maybe even to a region, you basically spread the risk. When you have a macro outlook of the whole development process, of course, it might help, but as ma'am explained, there is a lot of political uh, kinks which need to be ironed out before this can be not even successful, before even this can be imagined in this country. I
Okay.
think that answers the question.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
The next question is from Viswanandan Abhilash. Could you please share your views on how the RFCT LARR Act is framed while practicing land procurement through land acquisition versus land pooling?
Triveni, I'm losing connection. Can I have you again, Anna?
Yeah, sorry. Okay, could you please share your views on how the RFCT LARR Act is framed while practicing land procurement through land acquisition versus land pooling?
The whole process itself is different. There is something called compensation there in the first one, but there's nothing called compensation in land pooling. It's a partnership. You share. And
I
there
think
is a...
if I just come in, see, then the hint lies in the name. The name of the act is Right to Fair and Transparent, RFCT, Right to Fair Compensation and Transparency in Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation and Resettlement. Right, the hint is there in the name itself. The Acquisition Act of 1894 literally was just named Land Acquisition. It did not give two hoots about what happened to the landowner once the land is acquired. But the RFCT LARR is not like that. It has been designed to compensate the landowner, to rehabilitate them, to resettle them, right, and to give them a fair compensation and have a transparency in the process. That is not at all the the legislative mandate, I would say, of the land pooling policy. It is not.
Absolutely. And also I would like to add that land acquisition, because it functions under an act, it has a mandate of only being used for a public purpose. So there's this understanding of public purpose there, while land pooling can be used for development of any purpose. But by and large, what you see is that land pooling is used by the state to facilitate public purposes, because they have to fill the gap by acquisitions for the land that they're unable to acquire. But like you see in Magarpatta and Lavasa, land did get pooled for private purposes. So these two are absolutely two different sorts of things. And I would say that land acquisition is more of a formal, you can say, act that is there, and land pooling, land readjustment, land sharing, joint ventures, and all these models that you see are tools. They are not acts. They are tools that are used to ensure development on land. So it's not just for land assembly. So it's for a step beyond that when you develop the land into property. So that's the thing attached to that mechanism. Yes, Anna.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so the next question is, what would be your take on land acquisition process in huge infrastructure development projects such as the DM Freight Corridor? Which kind of approach should be taken? Should it be old and conventional like the land acquisition, or some other approach?
It's, ma'am, if I would answer this, see, there is no question of having an opinion here. We have an act in this country which governs the acquisition of land, for that kind of a project, and it is objectively good. Let me tell you here that it is being made out as a villain, right? As as something which stops progress from happening in this country, but it is not like that, right? The RFCT LARR is a fantastically drafted act. It takes into it takes into confidence, and it gives the landowner an agency of not only restoring their livelihood once they are uprooted from their owned land, but also giving them compensation, and in some cases giving them an annuity as well, right? So it is, I think RFCT LRR is a fantastic piece of le- uh, legislation which is being made out as a villain. And all these tools that you are seeing here are actually just trying to circumvent that act, right? Everybody just wants to wash out their hands and be done with it. That's the thing. That is my opinion. Just go with the act.
Yeah. If I would also like to add to that, see, when we're looking at such linear projects, and especially when we see these projects, transcending states and transcending geographies and topographies, then you have to note that land also, when we say it land, we here are saying land cover, also changes, right? Jurisdiction and its administration also changes. So there isn't any one answer or any one tool which will be the perfect fit here, because see, if there is a patch of land where there is NH and you want to broaden it to be a part of a corridor which you are developing as a logistics corridor or something that sort, then of course the land gets acquired according to the NHAI Act. If it comes in between and there is a land parcel with the railways, then it's a different story altogether. So it cannot be panned across as something that can be seen as one way of doing it. It can lie in a tribal land, so then the dynamics changes. If it is crossing a forest area, then the dynamics changes. If it's crossing a reserved area, some sort of a conserved area or a coastal line or something, that the dynamics changes. So every patch that you see that comes in front of you is a different story, is a different aspect. That is why we say that fit for purpose is good. But then you have to understand the purpose there. The purpose there cannot just be profit. It also has to be something more. So when you're designing a tool, when you're using a tool, when you're seeing what is what are the choices that you have, and especially when you really have the choice to be able to design a model for the project, then you really can do a lot with it. But we're seeing that effort in trying to design that actually fit for purpose model is not there. It's not that effort is not seen by the state in having those models in place.
Okay, so we're only going to be taking 2 more questions. The next one is, digital GIS mapping and drone mapping of lands would help in land pooling process. What are your views on this? So you can take this.
Yeah, of course it would. It is an excellent tool which has come up in the last few years, which will help in exacerbating the issues of conclusive land titling, right? Which is one of the major fundamental issues relating to not only land pooling but for any land assembly process. For any land assembly process, the first step is having the land. If you do not have the agency of saying that, okay, this is my piece of land and this is where my boundary ends, if you do not have that, it is very difficult for you to claim any compensation or any resettlement offer, or being a private developer, or any fancy word you want to attach to this. So the first step into this is actually having clear land titles, right? And drones and GIS mapping is going to play a huge part in this. And in fact, in a recent conference, we noticed that Madhya Pradesh government is actually taking the lead in this. So they are doing a lot of work, whether using modern technologies and satellite mapping and using GIS and other things in several pilot projects in the state of Madhya Pradesh. So they are also doing that. And in fact, there is a private organization known as Landesa, Landesa, Landesa. They are doing several projects in Odisha and Uttar Pradesh, and if I'm not wrong, in Tamil Nadu, where they are using drones and these GIS maps to facilitate these kind of processes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
This is the last question. Okay, I would like to know what are the different land supply mechanisms for private developers in Delhi? As you mentioned, one is land pooling method. What are the other methods through which private parties can assemble land? Is TOD, redevelopment of unauthorized colonies, industrial areas, another mechanism or not? Like Swatantra Bharat Mill is an example of assembly model which is developed by the DLF.
I think ma'am would be better placed to answer the question.
Yeah. So I think this also had appeared as a question on my chat box. So okay, so there's not one answer to it, but definitely the land banking, the land bank as a fundamental in India was for the first time tried and tested out in Delhi. And if you go about reading Gautam Bhan and his research, and I think his paper is called Planned Illegalities in the EPW. So if you read that, you will realize that land bank as a tool was never figured. And it created an artificial scarcity of land in Delhi. So, of course, land banking and keeping a lot of land aside for future development is not helping the state authorities, because I think it's not the issue of the tool per se, but it's the issue of managing the resource that you then bank, which is more of a matter of concern there. When it comes to the TOD policy, it's not only the TOD policy, that there is also TDR being used in Delhi now. They are opening it up, which allows the private sector to actually get in partnership with the landowners stations and TOD nodes that they have designed. As per the master plan, definitely as per zonal plans, definitely. So yes, this is coming up big time in Delhi. They're opening up. So I would say everything is post the 2000s in Delhi. Before that, the market is not opened up for the private developers to come, unless they auctioned a particular land for a particular development model. So DDA would auction, and if that auction would, or if that contract would include the private developer to make such a similar development, that would happen. Also, there were a lot of mill lands which were there in Delhi, which were redeveloped on this model. So you will see a few patches of that sort there. There were also a few land parcels which belonged to whose to the private sector for different sorts of developments, but they were not the model. Master plan of Delhi to the third master plan of Delhi, the private sector essentially did not see itself potentially coming up anywhere except the two new pockets, mega cities, million cities within a million city, which was Dwarka and Rohini. So you see only the two places where you see such model being practiced. So essentially, this is creating some sort of a scarcity of land available for the private sector. But I would like to tell you here that the scarcity was realized only when Delhi Development Authority realized that they were not being able to supply as much housing as they should, as per the rising need of housing in the state. It is only then when this finally was decided that they need to open up the private sector participation for building more number of houses simultaneously at one particular point in time. Before this was not a question, because this Delhi happens to be a more centrally governed city-state union territory. So the governance is pretty different than any other city that you would see. So this was a very conscious decision made by the Delhi Development Authority only when they realize that this is beyond their capacity to provide for. Yeah.
Okay, so this is the last question now. Siddhant Agarwal asks, isn't it better that something is planned by a private party better as compared to a government body?
Okay.
So we can deal with Siddharth's question later when we talk. But of course, ma'am, if you would like to answer Siddharth's question.
If I say if there are some defining principles, like if we say we have ethics, B here is the private sector. If you have ethics, if you can compromise with profit but provide for general public good, if you can say that, okay, maybe in this project I break even and in the next I make profits, then maybe privatizing everything is a very good idea, because it devolves services to the consumer level. It reaches to the end user directly. I can catch hold of the developer's collar and say,
We are losing, ma'am. Some connectivity issue there.
which is not coming up. So there's a concept called responsible real estate development. If you have responsible real estate development method, responsible real estate development, and rules and policies.
Okay, so you can take the question till she's back.
Yeah. See, Siddhant, the question that you've asked has not only just a planning uh, aspect to it, but it does have an ideological connotation as well, as ma'am started her response. I think we have ma'am is here. Ma'am, we actually lost you in between.
Yes. So, Siddhant, there is a concept called responsible real estate development that has all the aspects of ethics and responsible investment and responsible business and ethical, moral aspects to practicing real estate as a business. So, if the Indian government can provide a legal framework or a legislative framework or a regulatory framework that ensures responsible real estate development, then there is absolutely nothing like it that you do this. But if such regulations do not exist, then there is always a chance of collusion, fraud, corruption, and we all know what is happening around us right now with bankruptcies and all that. So so there's a possibility, but in India, I would say that time is far away. I think RERA is its first step towards the same aspect to be included in. Yeah.
To end the question, just consider the example where we are living. We are living in Noida, right? This place started as an industrial development authority, right? With a population of more than 1 million, we yet do not have a municipality. We do not have any elected representative in the city. There is absolutely no municipal oversight. There is no public oversight about the city, right? It is just being administered by an industrial authority, an IS officer who can be transferred at the whims and fancies of the political overlords. Then who has the accountability? Now, अगर आप government को accountable नहीं ठहरा पा रहे, how can you hold the collar of a private body and ask the tough questions to them?
And that is why we get so many resident welfare associations and all of that actually coming up. In fact, there is a home buyers association in Noida who are fighting cases where the developer hasn't provided houses. The
Yes.
project isn't complete. Alongside this, I will also like to point out that it's not like it's only the private sector that's messing up. If you look
Yeah.
at Noida Authority, they amended their master plan without getting it sanctioned by the National Capital Region Planning Board. Therefore, whatever they implemented in the master plan actually legally stands
Null and void.
encroachment, null and
Yes.
void.
Yes.
But of course, looking at the general good of people, it has not been done so. But so such just such things keep happening in the regulatory frameworks that we work within. But
Yes.
definitely, it's possible, Siddhant, to have an ideal world, provided the private sector sanitizes itself and the government realizes what they are made for.
Yes.
Okay, I think that's a good note to end on now. I'd like to thank Ms. Soni and Mr. Nanda for your thoughts and insights today, and also for very patiently answering questions. This wouldn't have been possible without the two of you. I'd like to thank the audience for their support and participation in this discussion. The turnout has been absolutely amazing, and I hope it continues to grow in this manner for future events as well. I also hope the City Speaks family continues to grow. Do take a look at the work both our speakers have undertaken. Be sure to visit the City Speaks website, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn for more on land pooling and land governance. With that, I'd like to conclude this webinar. Once again, thank you, everyone. Good night and goodbye.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, City Speaks.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, City.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.